The year was 1884, and the dust of the Missouri plains seemed to settle on everything, including dreams. Margaret Wilson stood frozen on the train platform in Riverdale Junction, clutching her worn carpetbag as the station master delivered news that shattered her last hope. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, shuffling uncomfortably. "Mr. Donovan sent word that there's been a change of circumstances. He won't be coming to collect you today, or any day, it seems." At 36 years old, with silver already threading through her chestnut hair, Margaret had traveled over 600 miles to marry a man she'd never met. Louis Donovan, cattle rancher, businessman, and her future husband, according to their correspondence over the past year. Now she stood abandoned, her letters of promise worthless in a town where she knew no one. "Did Mr. Donovan explain why?" Margaret asked, her voice steady, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The station master couldn't meet her eyes. "He only said that upon reflection he requires someone younger to bear children and withstand frontier life." What Margaret couldn't possibly know as she stood on that dusty platform, her future evaporating like morning dew, was that this crushing rejection would lead her to a man whose wounded heart matched her own, a man who would see value in her, experience where others saw only fading youth. Within a week, this Boston-born schoolteacher would face a choice that would transform not only her own destiny, but the lives of an entire community forgotten by progress and poisoned by grief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverdale Junction Hotel was modest but clean, its faded wallpaper and worn carpets speaking of better days when the railroad first brought prosperity to this corner of Missouri. Margaret sat at the small writing desk in her rented room, carefully calculating the money remaining in her purse. She had enough for 2 more nights and a ticket to Springfield, where distant cousins might take her in temporarily. After that, her future was as empty as the barren plains visible from her window. Margaret dipped her pen in ink and began a letter to her sister back in Boston. "My dearest Elizabeth, I write with heavy news. Mr. Donovan has rescinded his proposal upon learning of my arrival. It seems that despite our correspondence, which gave no indication of dissatisfaction, he found me unsuitable upon receiving word of my appearance at the station." The station master delivered his message with uncomfortable clarity. "I am considered too old for the rigors of frontier life and the bearing of children. I confess, this rejection cuts deeper than I anticipated. After Father's passing left us with so little, and your own growing family requiring space I could no longer justify occupying, this opportunity seemed providential. Now I find myself adrift once more, with diminished prospects and resources. Shall proceed to Springfield tomorrow to seek temporary accommodation with the Hadleys, though I have not corresponded with Cousin Amelia in nearly a decade and cannot be certain of my welcome." A sharp knock interrupted her writing. Margaret hastily blotted the ink and crossed to the door, opening it to find Mrs. Callahan, the hotel's proprietress, standing in the hallway. "Pardon the intrusion, Miss Wilson," she said. "There's a gentleman downstairs asking after you. A Mr. Fletcher from Cooperville." Margaret frowned. "I'm afraid I know no one by that name. He says he heard about your situation from the station master and has a proposition for you." Mrs. Callahan's expression was a mix of sympathy and curiosity. "He seems respectable enough. I can send him away if you prefer." "No," Margaret decided. Quickly, with options dwindling by the hour, she could hardly afford to dismiss potential opportunities. "Please tell Mr. Fletcher I'll be down shortly." 15 minutes later, Margaret descended the hotel's creaking staircase to find a tall, broad-shouldered man standing by the empty fireplace. His clothes were plain but well-maintained, worn boots polished to a dull shine, a clean collar beneath a wool jacket that had seen years of careful use. Grey streaked his dark beard, and deep lines framed serious eyes that spoke of hardship endured. Miss Wilson. He removed his hat, revealing a head of thick hair peppered with silver. I'm Ethan Fletcher, Mayor of Cooperville. I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me. Margaret nodded cautiously. Mrs. Callahan mentioned you had a proposition. I do, though it might be best discussed over lunch. The hotel dining room serves a decent stew, if you're amenable. Minutes later, seated at a corner table away from curious ears, Fletcher explained his visit. Cooperville lies 40 miles west of here, he began after they'd been served. It's a small settlement, about 200 souls, mostly farming families and those who support them. We find ourselves in urgent need of a teacher. I see, Margaret said, interest quickening despite her caution. Teaching had been her profession in Boston before financial necessity had driven her to consider marriage to a stranger. And how? Did you learn of my situation? Fletcher cut a piece of bread. This region has few secrets, Miss Wilson. Word travels fast along the railway line. When Bill Henderson, that's our station master, mentioned a stranded woman of education and respectable bearing had been abandoned by Louis Donovan, I rode out immediately. You knew of my arrangement with Mr. Donovan? Only by reputation. The man's known in 3 counties for his changing temperament. Fletcher's jaw tightened momentarily. This isn't the first time he's invited a mail-order bride only to change. His mind upon her arrival. The revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. She wasn't the first. Somehow that made the humiliation sharper. Our previous teacher, Mrs. Hammond, was called east to care for her ailing mother 2 months ago, Fletcher continued. We've been without instruction since then, and with 28 children needing education. 28. Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. That's quite a number for a small settlement. A shadow passed over Fletcher's face. Cooperville has more than its share of widows and orphans, Miss Wilson. Circumstances I'll explain if you're interested in the position. And what exactly are you offering, Mr. Fletcher? $15 monthly, plus room and board in the schoolhouse. It has modest living quarters attached. The town council can guarantee the position through the next school year, with renewal dependent on performance and community satisfaction. It was a fair offer, perhaps even generous for a frontier settlement. The salary wouldn't allow for savings, but it would provide shelter, sustenance, and purpose, all of which seemed precarious just hours ago. Why me? Margaret asked directly. Surely there are younger teachers seeking positions, women without... She hesitated. My limitations. Fletcher met her gaze steadily. Youth isn't what Cooperville needs, Miss Wilson. We need someone with experience and resilience, someone who's faced hardship and continued forward. His eyes held hers for a moment, longer than was strictly proper. Besides, I've found that those who've weathered disappointment often have the greatest capacity for understanding it in others. Before Margaret could respond, Fletcher reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. This is a letter signed by our town council authorizing me to offer you the position. Take the evening to consider. I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer. He placed the document beside her plate and rose. The stagecoach to Cooperville departs at noon, should you accept. After he'd gone, Margaret unfolded the letter. It was as he'd described, a formal offer of employment with the signatures of 5 council members, including Ethan Fletcher as mayor. What caught her attention, however, was a line near the bottom. Our community has suffered losses that have left many children without proper guidance. We seek not merely an instructor of letters and numbers, but a steady presence to help heal wounds still fresh. Margaret stared out the window at the setting sun, painting the prairie in gold and shadow. The rejection that had seemed so devastating hours before now appeared in a different light. Not an end, but perhaps a necessary detour leading to where she was truly needed. That evening, as she packed her meager belongings, Margaret found herself wondering about the wounds mentioned in the council's letter and the story behind Ethan Fletcher's weathered face and perceptive eyes. What had happened in Cooperville to leave so many children parentless? And why did the mayor himself ride 40 miles to recruit a rejected mail-order bride as their teacher? The answers would prove far more complicated and dangerous than she could possibly imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The stagecoach journey to Cooperville tested Margaret's endurance more than any Boston winter. For 6 grueling hours, the vehicle bounced over rutted trails that barely deserved to be called roads, sending jolts of pain through her body with each limestone outcropping they crossed. Dust seeped through every crack in the wooden frame, coating her traveling clothes and settling in her throat despite the handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Ethan Fletcher rode alongside on his chestnut mare, occasionally dropping back to exchange words with the driver before returning to his position. He'd offered little conversation since their departure, seemingly content to let Margaret absorb the changing landscape as they pushed westward. The fertile river valley gradually gave way to harsher terrain, rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and cedar, occasional farmsteads carved from the wilderness by sheer determination. By mid-afternoon, even these signs of civilization grew sparse. "Not much farther now," Fletcher called as they crested a particularly steep rise. He gestured toward the horizon where a cluster of buildings shimmered in the late afternoon heat. "Cooperville, population 204. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. 205, counting you. The town materialized slowly as they approached. Not the orderly grid Margaret had imagined, but a scattered collection of structures that seemed to have grown organically from the land itself. A white clapboard church with a modest steeple anchored one end of the main street. Several storefronts, a smithy, what appeared to be a doctor's office, and various dwellings of different sizes completed the picture. Some buildings showed signs of recent construction, while others bore the weathered look of frontier originals. "It's smaller than I expected," Margaret remarked as they rolled down the gentle slope toward town. "Cooperville has had its setbacks," Fletcher replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone, "but we're rebuilding." The stagecoach pulled to a stop before a 2-story structure with a broad porch spanning its width. A hand-painted sign identified it as Wilcox Mercantile and Post. Several townspeople paused in their activities, watching with undisguised curiosity as Fletcher dismounted and moved to assist Margaret. "Word travels fast," he murmured, offering his hand. "They've been without a teacher long enough to be eager. For your arrival." Margaret accepted his assistance, painfully aware of her travel-stained appearance as she descended to solid ground. Her legs trembled slightly after the long journey, but she forced herself to stand straight, meeting the gazes of her observers with what she hoped was a blend of dignity and approachability. A stocky man with impressive mutton chops emerged from the Mercantile, wiping his hands on a flour-sacked apron. "Mayor Fletcher, wasn't certain you'd make it back today." His curious eyes darted to Margaret. "Miss Wilson, allow me to introduce Harold Wilcox, proprietor of our general store, and unofficial town gossip," Fletcher said with a hint of wry humor. "Harold, this is Miss Margaret Wilson, Cooperville's new school teacher." Wilcox rushed forward, seizing Margaret's hand in both of his. "A blessing to meet you, ma'am, a genuine blessing. The children have been running wild these past months. My own niece Annie has forgotten half her letters already, if her mother's complaints are to be believed." His enthusiasm, though overwhelming after the long journey, was the first genuine welcome Margaret had received since arriving in Missouri. She found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Wilcox. I look forward to helping Annie recover her letters." Other townspeople began to approach, a grey-haired woman leaning on a cane, a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip, two men who appeared to be brothers judging by their similar features. Each offered greetings and expressions of gratitude for her arrival. Margaret did her best to commit names to memory, though fatigue made the task challenging. "Miss Wilson has had a long journey," Fletcher finally intervened, noticing her increasing weariness. "Perhaps we might continue introductions tomorrow after she's had a chance to rest and settle into the schoolhouse." Relief washed over Margaret. "That would be most appreciated. I'm eager to see where I'll be living and teaching." Fletcher nodded to the stagecoach driver, who began unloading Margaret's trunks. "I'll show you to the schoolhouse now. It's just beyond the church." As they walked the short distance, Fletcher pointed out various buildings and explained their functions. The blacksmith shop operated by Samuel Harris, the doctor's office, where Nathan Reed attended to everything from broken bones to childbirth, the small jail that served mostly as storage since Cooperville saw little serious crime. "And what do you do, Mr. Fletcher, when not recruiting schoolteachers?" Margaret asked. "You mentioned being mayor, but surely that's not a full-time occupation in a town this size." A faint smile touched his lips. "Observant. No, I operate a carpentry shop behind my home. I build furniture mostly, some house fixtures, coffins when necessary." Something in his expression closed at the last item. "The mayor's position is mostly voluntary, though it comes with a small stipend and more headaches than I care to count." They approached a modest single-story building, set slightly apart from the others. Freshly whitewashed walls gleamed in the late afternoon sun, and a small bell hung from a framework above the entrance. Wide windows flanked the door, offering ample natural light to the interior. "Here we are," Fletcher said, removing a key from his pocket. "The Cooperville school." He unlocked the door and stepped aside, allowing Margaret to enter first. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with rows of simple desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard. Bookshelves lined one wall, sparsely populated with worn volumes. A pot-bellied stove occupied the center of the room, cold now in the late spring warmth but essential during winter months. "The living quarters are through here," Fletcher continued, leading her toward a door at the rear of the classroom. "It's basic, but I think you'll find it comfortable enough." The private quarters consisted of two rooms, a small parlor with a cook-stove table, two chairs, and a modest bookshelf. And beyond that, a bedroom just large enough for a single bed, washstand, and wardrobe. Simple muslin curtains hung at the windows, and a braided rug added a touch of comfort to the wooden floor. Mrs. Peterson from the church group made up the bed with fresh linens yesterday, Fletcher explained. "The wood box is stocked, though you shouldn't need much fire except for cooking. There's a pump in back for water and an outhouse beyond the woodshed." Margaret moved slowly through the space, trailing her fingers along the smooth tabletop. After the uncertainty of the past days, the humble quarters felt like a palace, a place of her own, earned through her skills rather than matrimony. "It's perfect," she said softly. "More than adequate." Fletcher seemed pleased with her reaction. "School was suspended after Mrs. Hammond's departure, but with your arrival, we can resume next Monday. That gives you 3 days to prepare and the children time to be notified. How are the students divided? By age or ability?" Margaret asked, her mind already shifting to pedagogical concerns. "Both of necessity. You'll have children from 6 to 16 with widely varying levels of previous education. Some of the older boys attend only intermittently, especially during planting and harvest." Margaret nodded, familiar with the practical realities of rural education. "And supplies? Books, slates? The basics are in the classroom cupboard. Anything specialized you require, make a list for Harold Wilcox. The town council has approved a modest budget for school necessities." He hesitated, then added, "Though I should warn you that resources are limited." The stagecoach driver appeared. At the doorway, Margaret's trunks balanced precariously in his arms. Fletcher moved quickly to assist him, directing where to place the luggage. Once they were alone again, Margaret noticed Fletcher's demeanor shift. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "Miss Wilson, there's something you should understand about our community before you meet the children." His voice had dropped lower, more solemn than before. 2 years ago, Cooperville suffered a catastrophe. The silver mine 3 miles north collapsed. 27 men were lost. Understanding dawned with terrible clarity. The high number of children for such a small town, the wounds still fresh, mentioned in the council's letter. "Many of your students are fatherless," Fletcher continued. "Some lost brothers or uncles as well. The grief runs deep here, and it's affected the children in different ways. Some have withdrawn entirely, others act out their anger and confusion." Margaret sank slowly onto one of the kitchen chairs, processing this revelation. "That explains why you sought someone with life experience." Fletcher nodded, taking the chair opposite her. "A younger teacher might have the energy and latest educational theories from normal school, but what these children need most is someone who understands that life doesn't always follow the path we expect. Someone who can provide stability while acknowledging their losses." For the first time, Margaret noticed a thin gold band on Fletcher's left hand, worn but unmistakable. Yet he lived alone, by all indications. Had the mine disaster widowed him as well? Before she could consider whether such a personal question would be appropriate, a sharp knock sounded at the schoolhouse door. Fletcher rose to answer it, returning moments later with a thin woman whose severe hairstyle and rigid posture gave her the appearance of a steel rod in a calico dress. "Miss Wilson, may I present Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, head of our school board and wife of Reverend Whitman." Fletcher's tone had returned to its formal cadence. "Mrs. Whitman wished to welcome you personally." The woman's assessing gaze took in every detail of Margaret's appearance, lingering on the silver streaks in her hair. "Miss Wilson, we're grateful for your arrival, though I must admit you're somewhat older than we anticipated." Eleanor Whitman's critical assessment hung in the air between them. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret had weathered too many storms to be felled by this brisk wind of disapproval. "Age brings perspective, Mrs. Whitman," she replied evenly, "and perspective is something I understand your students might benefit from, given their experiences." Mrs. Whitman's thin lips pressed together momentarily before relaxing into what might generously be called a smile. "Indeed, Mayor Fletcher has explained our unique circumstances. I merely wish to ensure you're physically capable of managing 30 energetic children, some of whom have become quite unruly in recent months. I managed 45 students in my Boston classroom, many from difficult circumstances." Margaret countered. "Discipline has never been an area of concern in my teaching evaluations." Something that might have been approval flickered in Mrs. Whitman's eyes. "Very good. The Reverend and I believe firmly in the scriptural admonition not to spare the rod. The previous teacher was perhaps too lenient with certain behaviors." Fletcher cleared his throat. "Miss Wilson will develop her own appropriate methods, I'm sure. She comes highly recommended." This was a generous exaggeration, as they both knew he had only the station master's word about her profession and her own assertions during their brief acquaintance. Still, Margaret appreciated the support. "I shall expect you at services this Sunday, Miss Wilson," Mrs. Whitman continued. "The community should meet their new teacher in a proper setting. Afterward, there will be a welcoming dinner at the church hall." Her tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, but a requirement. "I'd be delighted," Margaret responded, though delighted was far from what she felt. A formal introduction would help establish her position, even if it came with an examination. by the town's matriarchs. After imparting detailed instructions about the expected time of arrival and appropriate attire, Mrs. Whitman finally took her leave. Margaret exhaled slowly as the door closed behind her. "That woman could freeze hell itself with a single glance," she murmured, then immediately colored as she realized the impropriety of such a comment to the town's mayor. To her surprise, Fletcher laughed, a genuine warm sound that transformed his solemn features. "Mrs. Whitman has many virtues, but a soft touch isn't among them. Still, she's been a pillar of strength since the mine collapse, organized care for the widows, found homes for orphans, established a fund for those most affected. She seems quite invested in the school. Her only son died in the disaster," Fletcher explained quietly. "He was 19, working his first month in the mine. Her way of honoring his memory is ensuring the other children receive proper education and moral guidance." The revelation softened Margaret's assessment. Grief manifested in many forms. She knew this from experience, having watched her father retreat into rigid religiosity after her mother's death. "I'll need to know more about what happened," she said finally. "If I'm to help these children, I must understand what they've endured." Fletcher nodded solemnly. "The town doesn't speak of it often, but you deserve the truth." He glanced out the window at the lengthening shadows. "It's getting late. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow. I could show you around Cooperville properly, introduce you to some of the families." "That would be most helpful," Margaret agreed, suddenly aware of her bone-deep weariness. The emotional and physical strain of the past days was taking its toll. After arranging to meet at 9 the following morning, Fletcher departed, leaving Margaret alone in what would be her home for the foreseeable future. She moved slowly through the modest space, unpacking essentials from her trunks. The familiar ritual provided comfort after so much upheaval. From her larger trunk, she removed a framed daguerreotype, her parents on their 25th anniversary, her father's hand resting protectively on her mother's shoulder. It was the last image taken before influenza claimed her mother 3 months later. Margaret placed it carefully on the small table beside her bed, a silent reminder of the love that had shaped her earliest years. As darkness fell, Margaret lit the oil lamp and settled at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the school register Mrs. Whitman had left behind. 32 names filled the pages, grouped roughly by age and ability. Beside many names, a small notation had been added in cramped handwriting: "Father deceased, mine," or occasionally, "Brother deceased, mine." In 3 cases, the stark notation read, "Both parents deceased, mine influenza." The scope of the community's loss took shape as she studied the pages. Nearly every family represented had been touched by the disaster. No wonder Fletcher had sought someone who understood grief. These children didn't need just education. They needed someone who could acknowledge their pain while helping them build a future beyond it. Margaret closed the register and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened town. Cooperville was nothing like she had imagined when she'd agreed to marry Lewis Donovan. Instead of a cattle ranch and a husband's protection, she had a schoolhouse and 32 wounded children looking to her for guidance. Strangely, the prospect felt more meaningful than the marriage she'd been prepared to enter. Here was purpose, not just security. Here was a chance to truly matter. The next morning dawned clear and mild. Margaret rose early, eager to explore her new surroundings in daylight. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, not so fine as to appear pretentious, but respectable enough to make a good impression as she met more townspeople. The schoolyard behind the building was larger than she'd noticed upon arrival, with a simple swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree and what appeared to be the remains of a ball field, now overgrown with spring grass. A vegetable garden occupied one corner, the newly turned soil suggesting recent preparation for planting. Mrs. Hammond started that with the children, a voice observed from behind her. Taught them science through growing things. Margaret turned to find a young woman watching her from beside the water pump, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She couldn't have been more than 20, yet something in her eyes spoke of experiences beyond her years. "I'm sorry I didn't hear you approach," Margaret said. "You have me at a disadvantage." "Sarah Reed," the young woman replied with a slight smile. "My husband's the town doctor. I saw you arrive yesterday but didn't get a chance to introduce myself with everyone crowding around." She nodded toward the garden. "I've been maintaining it since Mrs. Hammond left. Seemed a shame to let it go to waste." "That was thoughtful of you. I'd appreciate any guidance on continuing it with the students." Sarah nodded, shifting her laundry basket. "I could show you what's been planted and what we were planning. The older girls particularly enjoyed it, gave them something to care for. I'd like that very much." Margaret gestured toward the basket. "Though I shouldn't keep you from your chores. These are actually from the clinic. My husband had a difficult birthing case last night. Twins, mother and babies doing well, but it left quite a mess." Sarah's matter-of-fact tone suggested she was accustomed to the realities of frontier medicine. "I'll stop by later this afternoon about the garden, if that suits." Margaret readily agreed, watching as the young woman continued toward a clothes line, strung behind a nearby cottage. Sarah Reed seemed a potential ally in understanding this community, young enough to connect with the older students, yet apparently respected despite her age. At precisely 9 o'clock, Ethan Fletcher appeared. At the schoolhouse door, hat in hand. "Ready for your tour of our metropolis, Miss Wilson?" The hint of self-deprecating humor softened his usual reserve. "Eager to see all that Cooperville has to offer," she replied, matching his tone as she reached for her shawl. Fletcher offered his arm as they descended the schoolhouse steps. A gesture Margaret accepted after only a moment's hesitation. While she was typically cautious about appearances, particularly in a new community where her reputation was yet unformed, the practical benefit of support on the uneven pathway outweighed concerns about propriety. The town of Coopersville revealed itself slowly as Fletcher guided Margaret through its modest streets. Unlike the planned grid of eastern cities, the settlement had grown organically. Buildings clustered where the land allowed, connected by dirt paths that would turn to mud with the first heavy rain. "We began as a farming community," Fletcher explained as they passed the smithy, where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil punctuated their conversation. "Samuel Harris." He nodded. Toward the blacksmith, who paused his work to tip his hat, was one of the founders, along with my father-in-law, James Cooper. "Cooper as in Coopersville," Margaret noted. "Your wife's family founded the town?" A shadow crossed Fletcher's face. "Yes. The Coopers were among the first to settle this valley. Hannah, my wife, was their only child." His use of the past tense confirmed what Margaret had suspected from his worn wedding band. "She passed 6 years ago, childbirth fever." "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "Did the child—" Fletcher shook his head. "Our son lived. Daniel. He's 9 now." This revelation surprised her. Fletcher had made no mention of a child during their discussions of her position. Before she could inquire further, Fletcher continued walking, steering the conversation in a different direction. "The town developed gradually until 15 years ago, when silver was discovered in the North Ridge. The population nearly doubled within 2 years. New buildings went up, businesses opened." He gestured toward several newer structures. "The mine brought prosperity, but it changed the character of the place, brought in men without families, different types than the farmers and craftsmen who'd established the community." They paused before the church, a whitewashed structure with a steeple that appeared too slender for its base. Reverend Whitman arrived during that period, felt called to minister to the miners, though many weren't particularly interested in salvation. A hint of dry humor colored his tone. Still, he and Mrs. Whitman have been steady presences, especially after the collapse. As they continued past the church, Fletcher greeted various townspeople by name. Most responded warmly, though Margaret noticed a few seemed reserved, particularly the women. She wondered if word of her original purpose in coming west as a mail-order bride had spread along with news of her teaching credentials. The doctor's office and residence, Fletcher, indicated a neat two-story building with a small sign reading N. Reed, M.D. in the window. "I met his wife this morning," Margaret said. "She was tending the school garden. Sarah Reed's a remarkable young woman. Came here as a nurse during a typhoid outbreak 4 years ago, married the doctor 6 months later. She's been something of a guardian angel during difficult times." They approached a building, set slightly apart from the others, its windows barred and door reinforced with iron strapping. "Our jail," Fletcher explained, "though it sees little use these days, occasionally houses a drunk miner or cowhand until they sober up." Beyond the jail stood a long, low structure that appeared newer than surrounding buildings. "The Miners' Memorial," Fletcher said, his pace slowing. "Built after the disaster. The names of all 27 men lost are inscribed inside." Margaret studied the simple facade. "May we enter?" Fletcher hesitated, then nodded. "You should know what happened if you're to understand this town." The interior was cool and dim, light filtering through narrow windows along one wall. A stone table occupied the center of the single room, upon which sat a large leather-bound book. The walls were lined with wooden plaques, each bearing a name, date of birth, and the same date of death, April 17th, 1882. "It was a Tuesday morning," Fletcher said quietly, as Margaret moved slowly around the room, reading the names. The day shift had just begun. 43 men underground. There had been concerns about support beams in the lower levels, but the foreman, Preston Williams, assured everyone they'd been reinforced. Margaret paused before a plaque bearing the name Preston Williams, with the notation "Mine Foreman, age 42" beneath. "He died with his men," Fletcher confirmed, noting her gaze. "Whatever his mistakes, he paid the full price for them." What happened? According to the survivors, they heard creaking from the main support timbers, then a series of sharp cracks like gunfire. Williams ordered an immediate evacuation, but they'd barely begun moving when the first tunnel collapsed. That triggered a chain reaction. Only 16 men made it out, all from the upper levels. Fletcher moved to the leather book and opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten accounts from survivors, sketches of the mine before and after the collapse, and a list of the dead, with details about their families. The company sent investigators who declared it an act of God, absolving themselves of responsibility. They paid a pittance to the widows, barely enough for funeral expenses, then abandoned the mine as too costly to repair. His voice remained even, but Margaret heard the underlying bitterness. Some families left afterward. Those who remained had to rebuild their lives without the income the mine had provided. "And the children I'll be teaching?" Many lost fathers, brothers, uncles. Some boys had to become men overnight, taking whatever work they could find to support their mothers and siblings. Girls had to assume household responsibilities beyond their years. Fletcher closed the book gently. "You'll see it in their eyes, an awareness of life's fragility that children shouldn't have to bear." Outside once more, they walked in silence for several minutes, Margaret processing the weight of what she'd learned. The scope of the tragedy explained much about Cooperville. The high number of children relative to the population, the evident hardship despite the fertile land surrounding the town, the mix of solidarity and wariness she'd observed in its inhabitants. "Thank you for showing me this," she said finally. It helps me understand what I'll be facing with my students. Fletcher nodded. There's one more place you should see. He led her beyond the main settlement, along a path that wound up a gentle slope. At the crest stood a small cabin, meticulously maintained with a workshop attached. A carved wooden sign hung beside the door, reading simply, Fletcher Carpentry. My home, he said, and my livelihood. The location offered a perfect view of Cooperville spread below, the silver ribbon of a creek winding through the valley beyond. From this vantage point, the town appeared almost like a toy village, vulnerable yet persistent in the vast landscape. It's beautiful, Margaret observed, understanding why he'd chosen this spot despite its distance from town. It suits me. Fletcher hesitated, then gestured toward the door. Would you care to see inside? I should warn you, it's a bachelor's residence, though I try to maintain some semblance of order. Propriety suggested she decline, but curiosity won out. I'd be interested to see your work. The cabin's interior was surprisingly refined for a frontier dwelling. Simple furniture built with evident skill occupied the main room, a table and chairs, a secretary desk, bookshelves lined with more volumes than Margaret had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, tools of Fletcher's trade displayed on the mantel above it. You're quite accomplished, Margaret noted, running her fingers along the smooth edge of a chair back. Carpentry allows precision and control, Fletcher replied, something often lacking in life itself. He crossed to a door at the rear of the room. Daniel, are you there, son? A boy appeared in the doorway, brown hair tousled and clothes bearing the unmistakable signs of recent outdoor adventures. He regarded Margaret with frank curiosity, his features a younger echo of his father's. Daniel, this is Miss Wilson, Cooperville's new teacher. The boy straightened slightly. Ma'am? His greeting was polite if reserved. I'm pleased to meet you, Daniel, Margaret replied. Your father tells me you're 9. I expect you'll be in my intermediate group when school resumes. Daniel glanced at his father before responding. Yes, ma'am, though I'm advanced in mathematics. Mrs. Hammond had me working with the older students for arithmetic. The confidence in his assertion brought a smile to Margaret's lips. I'll be sure to assess everyone's abilities in the first week. If you're as advanced as you say, I'll certainly place you appropriately. This seemed to satisfy the boy, who relaxed slightly. Fletcher placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Daniel stays with the Reeds, the doctor and his wife, during the day while I'm working. They've been kind enough to look after him since... He didn't finish the thought. Understanding bloomed. Fletcher's reluctance to mention his son earlier likely stemmed from concern about how a new teacher might view their arrangement. A widower, raising a son alone, living outside town, working long hours. It explained much about the man's reserved demeanor and the shadows in his eyes. Well, Daniel, Margaret said brightly, I look forward to having you in my classroom. Perhaps you might show me your favorite books when school begins. I'm always interested in what my students enjoy reading. The boy's expression brightened slightly. I have a volume on North American birds with colored plates. That sounds fascinating. I'd be delighted to see it. Fletcher's face showed a flicker of gratitude at her easy acceptance of his son. Daniel, Miss Wilson and I still have matters to discuss regarding the school. Would you gather those wood scraps from the workshop for kindling as we talked about? Once the boy had gone, Fletcher's expression grew serious. I should explain. After Hannah died, I struggled to manage both my work and Daniel's care. Sarah. Reed offered to watch him during working hours. She's been like a mother to him. It's a sensible arrangement, Margaret assured him. Many families require creative solutions, particularly after loss. Fletcher studied her for a moment, as if weighing her sincerity. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for his shoulders relaxed fractionally. Not everyone in town shares your pragmatic view. Mrs. Whitman, in particular, feels a boy needs a more traditional household. Mrs. Whitman seems to have opinions on many subjects, Margaret observed diplomatically. A ghost of a smile touched Fletcher's lips. Indeed, you'll find Cooperville divided on certain matters, those who believe in adherence to traditional ways, and those who've learned that survival sometimes requires flexibility. And where do you stand, Mr. Fletcher? His eyes met hers directly. I believe in honoring traditions that serve a purpose while adapting those that don't. The West doesn't forgive rigid thinking for long. The sentiment resonated with Margaret's own evolving philosophy. Her journey west had begun from necessity and tradition, a spinster sister making way for a growing family, seeking security through marriage as society expected. Yet, here she stood, employment contract in hand, preparing to shape young minds in a community healing from tragedy. Adaptation indeed. Sunday arrived with a clarity of sky that seemed to mock Margaret's nerves. She stood before the small mirror in her quarters, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. The navy blue dress she'd chosen was her finest. Conservative. Enough for church, but with subtle details in the collar and cuffs that spoke of quality craftsmanship. She'd arranged her hair carefully, containing the silver strands that had caused Lewis Donovan to reject her. Today marked her formal introduction to Cooperville, and she understood the significance. First impressions would shape her reception, both as a teacher and as a newcomer to this close-knit community. The church bell began its solemn tolling as Margaret locked the schoolhouse door behind her. Families were already making their way toward the white clapboard building, Sunday finery. A stark contrast to their everyday attire. Children darted between adults, momentarily free from chores and responsibilities before being corralled by parents for the service. "Miss Wilson," a young voice called. Sarah Reed approached, her husband beside her and Daniel Fletcher following closely. "We thought you might appreciate company for your first Sunday." "That's very kind," Margaret replied, genuinely grateful for the friendly faces. Dr. Reed was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a reserved demeanor that complemented his wife's warmth. "Nathan Reed," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Welcome to our little community. I hope you're finding your accommodations satisfactory." "Quite comfortable, thank you. Your wife has been most helpful in orienting me to the town." As they walked toward the church, Margaret noted how Daniel remained close to Sarah, his hand occasionally brushing against her skirt in a gesture that spoke of long familiarity and trust. The boy had clearly formed a deep attachment to the woman, who had stepped into a maternal role in his life. The church interior was simple but carefully maintained. Wooden pews faced a raised pulpit where Reverend Whitman, a tall, austere man whose features seemed permanently arranged in an expression of solemn judgment, was reviewing notes for his sermon. Mrs. Whitman occupied the front pew, her posture as rigid as if the bench had been constructed of iron rather than oak. Sarah guided Margaret to a pew midway down the aisle, not too close to feel scrutinized, not so far back as to appear reluctant, she whispered, with the barest hint of mischief in her eyes. Margaret suppressed a smile as she took her seat, grateful for the young woman's understanding of social dynamics. The church filled quickly, with families arranging themselves in what was evidently a long-established pattern. She noted the curious glances directed her way, some openly assessing, others more discreetly observational. Mayor Fletcher arrived just before the service began, slipping into a pew across the aisle. He nodded gravely toward Margaret, but made no attempt to join their group. She noticed he sat alone, a small island of solitude in the sea of family units. Reverend Whitman's sermon centered on the biblical story of Ruth, a foreigner who found purpose in a new land through devotion and hard work. The parallel to Margaret's situation was far from subtle, and she felt the weight of expectation settle more firmly on her shoulders with each scriptural reference. "The stranger among us may bring gifts we cannot yet recognize," the Reverend intoned, his gaze sweeping across the congregation before settling briefly on Margaret. "It falls to us to receive these gifts with gratitude while ensuring that our community's values remain steadfast and true." The message was clear enough. She was welcome, so long as she conformed to Cooperville's established ways. Margaret kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she reflected on the complexity of her position. She had come to teach, not to transform. This community, yet true education inevitably brought change. Following the service, congregants gathered outside for the promised welcoming dinner. Tables had been arranged in the churchyard, laden with an impressive array of dishes that testified to the community's determination to present their best face, despite evident hardship. Mrs. Whitman intercepted Margaret immediately. "Miss Wilson, you must meet everyone properly." Without waiting for agreement, she guided Margaret through the crowd, introducing her to family after family in rapid succession. The Hendersons, whose twin boys were known for mischief. The Wilsons, no relation, whose daughter showed particular aptitude for mathematics. The Pattersons, whose eldest son had been lost in the mine collapse, leaving the mother to raise 4 younger children alone. The Griffiths, Welsh immigrants who had arrived just before the disaster and lost both father and eldest son. Margaret did her best to commit names and circumstances to memory, knowing this information would prove valuable when school began. She noted which families seemed prosperous despite the mine's closure and which showed signs of struggle. She observed which children appeared well-adjusted and which exhibited the wariness characteristic of those who had endured significant loss. "Miss Wilson," a voice interrupted her observations, "I've brought you some lemonade. You must be parched from all this socializing." Sarah Reed stood beside her, offering a welcome glass of pale yellow liquid. Margaret accepted gratefully, using the moment to catch her breath. "Mrs. Whitman is nothing if not thorough," Sarah said quietly. "I believe she's introduced you to every family except those foolish enough to miss church today." "It's helpful to meet my future students and their parents," Margaret replied diplomatically, though her feet ached from standing and her cheeks felt stiff from maintaining a pleasant expression through countless introductions. "Yes, but perhaps a moment to actually enjoy some food would be welcome." Sarah guided her toward a table, set somewhat apart from the main gathering. "I've saved you a plate. The Carlson sisters make the best fried chicken in the county, and Mrs. Patterson's cornbread is worth fighting over." The respite was brief, but rejuvenating. The food was indeed excellent, testifying to the skills honed by frontier women who could create abundance from limited resources. As they ate, Sarah provided additional context about various families, which had been in Cooperville from its earliest days, which had arrived during the mining boom, which alliances and tensions predated the disaster. The collapse divided the town in subtle ways, she explained between bites. Some blamed the mining company entirely, others felt the men had ignored warning signs. Grief doesn't always bring people together, sometimes it creates fault lines. "And where does Mayor Fletcher stand in these divisions?" Margaret asked, noting how he moved through the gathering, exchanging brief words with various groups, but belonging fully to none. Sarah considered before answering. "Ethan occupies a unique position. His father-in-law founded the town, but he himself came from elsewhere. He opposed the mine's development initially, concerned about the rapid change it would bring, but later served on the safety committee. After the collapse, he worked tirelessly to recover bodies and support survivors, yet some whisper he could have done more to prevent it." "That seems unfair," Margaret observed. "Grief often seeks targets," Sarah replied simply. "And Ethan makes a convenient one, visible as mayor, but set apart by temperament and circumstance." Their conversation was interrupted by Daniel, who approached with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Reed says he's taking me fishing this afternoon. Can Miss Wilson come too?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Daniel, Miss Wilson has had a busy morning. She might prefer to rest." The boy's face fell slightly, and Margaret found herself unwilling to disappoint him. A quiet afternoon by the stream sounded far more appealing than returning to her empty quarters to contemplate the challenges ahead. "Actually, I'd enjoy some fresh air and scenery," she said, "if the invitation includes me." Daniel beamed. "I can show you the best fishing spots and the bird nests I've been observing for my nature journal." Nathan Reed joined them, medical bag in hand. "I've promised young Fletcher here some angling instruction, but I've just received word that the Peterson baby is coming earlier than expected. Would you ladies mind taking him without me? I could be hours." Sarah assured her husband they would manage, while Daniel's excitement at the prospect of an outing with two adults entirely focused on him was palpable. "Mayor Fletcher should join us," Margaret suggested, glancing toward where Ethan stood in conversation with Harold Wilcox. "Surely he'd enjoy spending Sunday afternoon with his son." An unreadable expression crossed Sarah's face. "Ethan rarely takes leisure time, but you're welcome to ask." Margaret's invitation clearly surprised Fletcher. He hesitated, glancing toward her, Mrs. Whitman, who was observing their interaction with undisguised interest. "I have some matters requiring attention in town," he began reluctantly. "On Sunday?" Margaret countered. "Surely even the mayor deserves a day of rest, and Daniel seems quite excited about the expedition." Something in Fletcher's expression shifted as he looked at his son's hopeful face. The reserve that seemed his natural state softened momentarily. "Perhaps for an hour or two," he conceded, and so it was that Margaret found herself walking alongside the creek that meandered behind Cooperville, watching as Daniel eagerly pointed out landmarks to his father, and Sarah identified wildflowers growing along the banks. The formal atmosphere of church and community scrutiny fell away, replaced by the simple pleasure of exploration under a clear spring sky. Fletcher gradually relaxed as they walked, his stride lengthening and shoulders loosening. When Daniel discovered a peculiar insect beneath a rock, the mayor knelt beside his son without concern for his Sunday trousers, examining the creature with genuine interest and answering the boy's rapid-fire questions with patience. "You're good." "With him," Margaret observed quietly as they followed the path deeper into a grove of cottonwoods, Sarah and Daniel having rushed ahead to investigate a splash in the creek. "Not always," Fletcher admitted. "There are days when I look at him and see only what he's lost. A mother who would have guided him better than I can." He picked up a fallen branch, testing its strength absently. "Other days I see Hannah in his expressions and mannerisms, and it's both comfort and pain simultaneously." The candor of his response surprised her. "Grief is like that, a companion that changes faces without warning." Fletcher glanced at her sharply. "You speak from experience." "Yes," Margaret admitted, her gaze following the path of a hawk circling above the trees. "My mother died when I was 17. Influenza. My father followed 8 years later. Heart failure, though I sometimes think it was equally a failure of will. Without my mother, he seemed to lose his purpose." She hadn't intended to share such personal details, but something about this secluded spot, away from the watchful eyes of Cooperville, invited confidence. Perhaps it was also the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who understood how loss reshapes the landscape of one's life. "And no husband?" Fletcher asked, then immediately shook his head. "Forgive me, that's not a proper question." "It's natural enough," Margaret replied with a small shrug. "I was engaged once, in my 20s. Jonathan Mercer, a colleague at the school where I taught. He died before the wedding. Typhoid." She recited the facts with the practiced detachment of someone who had told the story many times, though rarely by choice. After that, I focused on my teaching career. Boston has no shortage of spinster school teachers. Fletcher nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying. And then circumstances brought you west. My sister's family needed the space I occupied in their home. With father gone and my prospects limited in Boston, I answered Mr. Donovan's advertisement. A wry smile touched her lips. Who could have predicted that my age, which disqualified me as a bride, would recommend me as Cooperville's teacher? Before Fletcher could respond, Daniel's excited shout drew their attention. "Father, Miss Wilson, come see what we found." They followed the sound to a small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool. Daniel stood ankle-deep in the water, pants rolled to his knees, pointing toward something beneath the surface. Sarah knelt on the bank, equally fascinated. "River mussels," she explained as they approached. "Quite a bed of them. They're edible, and the shells can be used for buttons and inlay work." "Can we collect some?" Daniel asked eagerly. "Mrs. Peterson taught me how to cook them last summer." Fletcher looked to Margaret, a question in his eyes. She smiled. "I've never harvested mussels before. It seems an educational opportunity." For the next hour, they waded in the cool water, gathering the bluish-black shells under Daniel's enthusiastic direction. The boy proved knowledgeable about which specimens were suitable and which should be left to grow. Margaret found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, as Daniel splashed about, his father occasionally joining in his antics. Sarah eventually announced they should head back if they wanted to cook their harvest before sundown. As they walked, Daniel ranged ahead with the energy only a 9-year-old boy could maintain after such exertions. Sarah followed at a slight distance, leaving Margaret and Fletcher to bring up the rear. "Thank you," Fletcher said quietly as they walked. "For what?" "For suggesting I join you today, for engaging with Daniel so naturally." His voice took on a hesitant quality. "Since Hannah died, I've struggled to balance my responsibilities as father and provider. Days like this have been rare." Margaret considered her response carefully. "Sometimes we become so focused on providing what we believe others need that we forget to ask what they actually want. Perhaps Daniel needs his father's presence more than anything you could build or earn for him." Fletcher was silent for several paces, digesting her words. "You have insight, Miss Wilson. It's a quality that will serve you well in the classroom." "Margaret," she said impulsively. "When we're away from formal settings, I'd prefer Margaret." His eyebrows rose slightly at the impropriety, but he nodded. "Ethan, then, at least in similar circumstances." They had reached the edge of town, where reality awaited in the form of curious glances from those who observed their return. The new teacher, the reserved mayor, the doctor's wife, and the mayor's son, all carrying makeshift sacks of river mussels, their clothing bearing evidence of their creekside adventures. "I fear we've given Mrs. Whitman fresh material for her disapproval," Margaret murmured, noting how the Reverend's wife watched from her porch, lips pressed into a thin line. "A burden I'm willing to bear," Ethan replied with unexpected lightness. "This has been the most pleasant afternoon I've spent in longer than I can recall." Sarah invited them all to the Reed household for supper, where they would cook their foraged treasures. The simple meal that followed, mussels steamed with wild herbs, cornbread saved from the church dinner and preserved peaches, surpassed many formal dinners Margaret had attended in Boston. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Daniel's enthusiastic descriptions of their expedition for Nathan Reed, who had returned, tired but satisfied, from delivering the Peterson baby. As twilight deepened, Ethan rose reluctantly. "We should head home. Daniel has chores to complete before bed, and I imagine Miss Wilson, Margaret, needs time to prepare for her first day of teaching tomorrow." The reminder of her impending responsibilities. sobered Margaret. Tomorrow she would face 32 children, each with their own needs, abilities and wounds. The peaceful interlude of their Sunday outing would give way to the real purpose that had brought her to Cooperville. "You'll do splendidly," Sarah assured her at the door, as if reading her thoughts. "The children need someone exactly like you." "Thank you for today," Margaret replied, touched by the young woman's confidence, "for including me so readily in your circle." Sarah's smile was warm. Coopersville can be insular, but those of us who came by choice rather than birth understand the value of welcoming newcomers. Besides, she added with a hint of mischief, "it's been some time since I've seen Ethan Fletcher enjoy himself so thoroughly. That alone was worth the mud on my boots." The walk back to the schoolhouse was quiet, the town settling into Sunday evening routines. Ethan and Daniel accompanied her, the boys' earlier energy now tempered by a full day's activities. "I'll check that the stove is drawing properly before we leave you," Ethan offered as they reached the schoolhouse. "Nights can still be cool this time of year." Inside, Daniel immediately gravitated to the bookshelves while his father examined the stove and added wood from the box beside it. Margaret watched them both, struck by the contrast between this moment of casual domesticity and the formal distance that had characterized their first meeting just days ago. "Your library is limited," Daniel observed, running his fingers along the sparse shelf. "Our house has more books." "Daniel," his father admonished gently, "that's not polite." "It's a fair observation," Margaret acknowledged. "Perhaps you might recommend titles I should request for the school. As my most avid reader, your input would be valuable." The boy brightened at being treated as a consultant rather than a critic. "I could make a list. Father has books on natural history, carpentry and adventure stories. Much more interesting than these old readers." "That would be most helpful," Margaret encouraged, "though we'll still need to use the readers for basic instruction." As the Fletchers prepared to leave, Daniel surprised Margaret with a quick, impulsive hug. "I'm glad you're our teacher instead of going to marry that stupid Mr. Donovan," he declared with a child's brutal honesty. "Daniel!" Ethan's shock was evident, confirming Margaret's suspicion that her original purpose in coming west was indeed common knowledge in Coopersville. "It's all right," she assured him, though her cheeks warmed slightly. "I find myself sharing Daniel's assessment of the situation." After they departed, Margaret moved through her small quarters, preparing for the week ahead. She laid out her teaching dress for the morning, reviewed her planned lessons one final time, and set water to heat for a bath. Tomorrow would test her skills and resilience in ways her Boston classroom never had. As she soaked in the modest tub, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had stood abandoned on a train platform, her carefully constructed future crumbling around her. Tonight, she prepared to shape young minds in a community that had suffered its own bitter disappointments. Perhaps that was why she felt a growing connection to Coopersville, despite its challenging circumstances. Like her, this town had been forced to reimagine its future after devastating loss. And like her, it was finding ways to continue, adapting to new realities while honoring what came before. The water cooled as Margaret considered the faces she'd encountered today, children who would soon be her pupils, parents entrusting her with their education, and Ethan Fletcher, whose initial reserved demeanor had given way to glimpses of a man capable of both deep feeling and simple joy. Too old, Lewis Donovan had judged her. Yet here in Coopersville, her age and experience seemed not liabilities, but assets, qualities that might help heal a wounded community. For the first time since receiving that crushing rejection, Margaret felt something like gratitude toward the man who had found her wanting. His dismissal had led her here, where perhaps she was needed far more than in his cattle ranch. With that comforting thought, she dressed for bed and extinguished the lamp, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting for new beginnings. Margaret woke before dawn, her mind already racing with preparations for the day ahead. She dressed with particular care in her most professional attire, a high-necked shirtwaist of crisp cotton and a charcoal skirt that spoke of authority without ostentation. Her hair she arranged in a simple but neat style, acknowledging that practical concerns would outweigh vanity in a classroom of energetic children. The school bell, unused since Mrs. Hammond's departure, gleamed in the early light, freshly polished by Margaret's own hands the previous evening. At precisely 8 o'clock, she grasped the rope and rang it, sending its clear tone across Cooperville as a summons and announcement. Education had returned to their community. She stood straight-backed on the schoolhouse steps as children began to appear, first in ones and twos, then in small groups, some accompanied by parents, others arriving independently. They approached with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to open excitement. "Good morning," Margaret greeted each child with a smile and direct eye contact. "I'm Miss Wilson. Welcome to school." Some responded with shy mumbles, others with clear good mornings of their own. A few, mostly older boys, maintained stolid silence, assessing her with the skepticism of those who had already experienced too many broken promises. Daniel Fletcher arrived with Sarah Reed, his face alight with anticipation. "I brought my bird book," he announced, patting his satchel importantly, "and the list of other books you should request." "Thank you, Daniel." "That will be most helpful," Margaret replied, touched by his enthusiasm. "Please find a seat inside, while I greet the rest of your classmates." By 8:30, 30 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 had assembled in the schoolroom. Margaret closed the door and moved to the teacher's desk, surveying the group that would occupy her days for the foreseeable future. "Good morning, students," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back row. "I am Miss Wilson, your new teacher. Before we begin our lessons, I'd like to learn something about each of you." She conducted a simple roll call, asking each child to stand briefly and state their name, age, and one thing they enjoyed doing. This exercise served multiple purposes, helping her connect names with faces, assessing English language skills, and identifying potential interests she might incorporate into lessons. The youngest children responded eagerly, while the teenagers required more encouragement. Margaret noted which students spoke confidently and which seemed reluctant to draw attention to themselves. She observed the worn but clean clothing that spoke of limited resources carefully maintained, and the occasional finer garment that indicated relative prosperity. "Thank you all," she said when the introductions concluded. "Now, before we divide into our learning groups, I'd like to share something about myself. I came to Cooperville to teach because I believe education is the greatest gift we can give or receive. Knowledge opens doors that might otherwise remain closed." She moved from behind the desk, choosing to stand closer to the students. "I know that many of you have experienced difficult changes in your lives. The mine collapse affected everyone in this community, some more directly than others. I want you to know that while we are here to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and other subjects, this classroom is also a place where you are safe to ask questions, express your thoughts, and work through challenges together." Several children shifted uncomfortably at the direct mention of the disaster, but Margaret held their gazes steadily. "In my experience, acknowledging what we have survived helps us move forward more effectively than pretending painful events never happened." A girl of about 13 raised her hand hesitantly. Margaret checked her mental roster. Elizabeth Patterson, who had lost her father in the collapse. "Yes, Elizabeth. Mrs. Hammond never mentioned the mine," she said quietly. "She said it would just make everyone sad again." Margaret considered her response carefully, aware that her approach to this sensitive topic would set the tone for her relationship with these children. "There is wisdom in Mrs. Hammond's perspective," she acknowledged. Dwelling constantly on painful memories can prevent healing. However, pretending that something significant never happened can also cause harm. My hope is that we can find a balance, acknowledging your experiences while focusing primarily on building your futures. The answer seemed to satisfy the girl, who nodded thoughtfully before lowering her hand. Margaret then proceeded with academic assessments, dividing the students into 3 groups based roughly on age and ability, setting independent work for 2 groups while she evaluated the third more closely. By midday, patterns had emerged. The youngest children were generally at grade level, suggesting their education had not yet suffered significantly from interruptions. The middle group showed more variance, with some students clearly advanced and others struggling with basic concepts. The oldest students displayed the greatest disparities, some excelling academically despite the community's challenges, others having effectively abandoned their studies for practical work. One boy in particular caught Margaret's attention, William Griffith, 15, whose father and brother had died in the collapse. He sat at the back of the room, completing assignments with surprising speed and accuracy while maintaining an expression of studied indifference. When she reviewed his work, she found not only correct answers, but evidence of analytical thinking beyond his years. During the lunch break, as children dispersed to the schoolyard with their packed meals, Margaret approached him. "William, your arithmetic work shows considerable ability." The boy shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Numbers make sense, not much else does." "I understand you work at the livery stable after school?" "Someone has to earn money," he replied without emotion. "Ma can't manage alone with the little ones." Margaret nodded, recognizing the burden resting on his young shoulders. "I'd like to offer you some additional materials, more advanced work that might challenge you. Would that interest you?" For the first time, William looked directly at her. "What's the point? I'm not going to college or anything. I'll be working full-time once I turn 16. "Knowledge has value beyond formal education," Margaret responded, "and I believe you have potential that shouldn't be wasted regardless of your circumstances." A flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps merely curiosity, crossed the boy's face before he masked it with another shrug. "You can give me whatever you want. Don't expect much." It was a small opening, but Margaret would take it. "I expect only that you try. The results are up to you." The afternoon session proceeded more smoothly as students adjusted to her teaching style and expectations. By dismissal time, Margaret had formed preliminary impressions of most children's abilities and temperaments, though she knew the more guarded ones would require time to reveal their true capabilities. As the students filed out, Sarah Reed appeared at the doorway. "I've come to collect Daniel," she explained, "and to see how your first day progressed." "Quite well, I think," Margaret replied, gathering papers into neat stacks. "The children are generally eager to learn, though some naturally need more encouragement than others." Sarah smiled knowingly. "You've noticed our William Griffith, then? Brilliant boy, adamantly determined not to let anyone see it." "He made his resistance quite clear," Margaret acknowledged, "yet he completed every assignment perfectly. His mother worries about him. Since the collapse, he's focused entirely on working and supporting the family, at the expense of his own childhood." Sarah's expression grew pensive. "Nathan, Dr. Reed, says William reminds him of Ethan after Hannah died. The same withdrawal, the same single-minded focus on practical matters to avoid confronting grief." This comparison intrigued Margaret. "The mayor seems to have found some balance eventually." "Only recently," Sarah murmured, then quickly changed the subject as Daniel approached, eager to share details of his day. After they departed, Margaret continued organizing the classroom and preparing for the next day's lessons. She was so absorbed in her work that the knock at the door startled her. Twilight had fallen while she worked, and she lit the oil lamp before answering. Ethan Fletcher stood on the threshold, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to inquire about the first day." "Not at all," Margaret replied, surprised but pleased by his interest. "Would you care to come in? I've just brewed tea." In her small quarters, they sat at the kitchen table. While Margaret recounted the day's events, the children's responses to her introduction, the academic assessments, the particular case of William Griffith. "William carries too much for his age," Ethan observed. "His father was a good man, skilled, engineer who questioned the mine's safety practices regularly. After he died, the boy took on the role of family provider almost immediately. He reminds me of students I had in Boston," Margaret said. "Children from immigrant families who balanced work and school, determined to improve their circumstances through education. But William seems to have lost that belief in future possibilities." "The collapse destroyed more than lives," Ethan replied soberly. "It shattered the community's sense of progress. Before, parents could imagine their children achieving more than they had. Afterward," he shook his head, "it's difficult to dream of the future when the present demands everything you have." Margaret considered this perspective. Then perhaps restoring that capacity for hope is as important as academic instruction. "It would be a significant gift to Cooperville," Ethan agreed, "though I'm not certain how one accomplishes such a thing." "One child at a time," Margaret answered simply, "beginning with helping them see possibilities beyond their current circumstances." Ethan studied her with an intensity that might have made her uncomfortable from another man. With him, however, it felt like genuine interest rather than inappropriate. "Attention! You have unusual insight, Miss Wilson." "Margaret," he said finally, "most teachers who've passed through these territories focus solely on basic skills and moral instruction. Few consider the deeper needs of their students." "Perhaps. That's the advantage of being too old," she replied with a touch of wry humor. "Experience teaches lessons no formal education can provide." The slight tensing of Ethan's shoulders told Margaret he'd heard about Donovan's rejection and her reason for initially coming west. Her direct reference to it seemed to both surprise and relieve him. "She brings wisdom," he offered carefully, "wisdom our children desperately need." They spoke for another hour about the school, the students, and the community's needs. Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to Ethan's thoughtful perspectives and evident care for Cooperville's welfare. Behind his reserved exterior was a mind that considered problems from multiple angles and sought practical solutions rather than easy answers. When he finally rose to leave, the night had deepened considerably. "I've kept you too long," he apologized. "You must be exhausted after your first day." "The conversation was worth the late hour," Margaret assured him. "I appreciate your insights about the children and the town." At the door, Ethan hesitated. "I wonder, I thought perhaps—" He paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Daniel mentioned you might need additional books for the school. I have a modest library you're welcome to borrow from until the town council approves. Funds for new acquisitions." The invitation seemed innocent enough, yet Margaret sensed it represented something more, an overture of friendship perhaps, from a man unaccustomed to making such gestures. "That would be most helpful," she replied warmly. "Perhaps Daniel could help select appropriate volumes since he's familiar with both your collection and the school's needs." "Sunday afternoon, then," Ethan suggested. "After church. Daniel would enjoy the task, I think, and afterward we might—" He trailed off, then it continued more formally. "That is, a light meal would be the least we could offer in exchange for your time." "Sunday would be perfect," Margaret agreed, understanding the effort this invitation had required from him. "I look forward to it." As she watched him walk away, a tall, solitary figure in the moonlight, Margaret reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. Lewis Donovan's rejection had seemed a devastating blow less than a week ago. Now, she found herself establishing a place in a community that needed precisely what she could offer. Not youth and fertility, but wisdom, perspective, and the steady presence of someone who understood how to rebuild after loss. And perhaps, she thought with a small smile, Cooperville offered something she needed as well. Purpose beyond mere survival, and the possibility of connections based on genuine understanding, rather than convenience or convention. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to Margaret's life in Cooperville. Mornings began with the ringing of the school bell, followed by hours of instruction, assessment, and the gradual building of trust with her students. Afternoons often extended into early evening as she provided additional help to those who sought it, prepared lessons, and corresponded with educational suppliers about much-needed materials. The promised Sunday visit to the Fletcher home evolved into a weekly tradition. After church services and the obligatory socializing that Mrs. Whitman insisted upon, Margaret would accompany Ethan and Daniel up the hill to their cabin. There, amid comfortable furnishings crafted by Ethan's own hands, they would share a simple meal and conversation that gradually deepened from educational matters to personal philosophies and quiet reflections on life's unexpected turns. Daniel flourished under Margaret's guidance, his natural curiosity finding direction in structured learning. He developed a particular interest in natural sciences, covering pages of his school journal with detailed observations of local flora and fauna. At his father's suggestion, Margaret incorporated Daniel's findings into lessons for the entire class, elevating the boy's status among his peers while demonstrating the value of careful observation. Other students showed similar progress, though William Griffith remained a particular challenge. The boy continued to complete assignments with minimal visible effort, maintaining emotional distance even as his academic performance outpaced his classmates. Margaret persisted in providing him with advanced material, occasionally leaving books or articles on his desk without comment, allowing him to pursue knowledge without acknowledging his interest to others. One Wednesday afternoon, in her third week of teaching, Margaret kept William after dismissal. "I'd like your assistance with something," she said, gesturing toward a shelf of books she had recently reorganized. "I'm considering creating a lending library for students to take books home. I'd appreciate your thoughts on which volumes might appeal to different ages." William eyed her suspiciously. "Why ask me? Because you've read more than you admit," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "I've seen you finish the readers I assigned and move on to whatever other material you can find. Your judgment would be valuable." The directness of her assessment seemed to catch him off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the shelf, running his fingers along the book spines with unexpected gentleness. "These primers are too simple for anyone above 8, he began reluctantly. "But the history volumes are too dense for most below 14. He pulled out a slender volume of American biographies. "Something like this, though. Stories about real people accomplishing things that might interest different ages." For nearly an hour, William assessed the school's modest collection, offering insights that revealed both his own reading preferences and a surprising understanding of his peers' interests. As twilight approached, he suddenly seemed to remember himself, stepping back from the shelf abruptly. "I need to get to the livery. Mr. Harris expects me by 5. "Of course," Margaret said. "Thank you for your help. It was invaluable." William paused at the door. "Miss Wilson, if you're serious about a lending library, my father had books, engineering texts, mostly. They're just sitting in a trunk at home. Ma would probably be glad to see them used." The offer represented more than books. It was the first personal information William had volunteered, an acknowledgement of his father's legacy and his own connection to it. Margaret recognized the significance. "That would be a wonderful addition," she replied. "Perhaps you could show me which ones might be suitable when you have time." A brief nod was his only response before he slipped out the door, but Margaret counted it as progress nonetheless. That evening, as she recorded the day's events in her journal, a knock interrupted her writing. She opened the door to find Sarah. "Read, a covered basket in hand. I've brought dinner," the young woman announced. "Nathan's been called to a farm 10 miles out. Twin calves arriving backward, apparently, and I thought you might appreciate company." Over a meal of cold chicken, pickled vegetables and fresh bread, Sarah shared news of the town. Harold Wilcox's daughter engaged to a shopkeeper from the next settlement, Reverend Whitman planning revival meetings for the summer, and more personal observations about various community members. "Mrs. Whitman has been unusually attentive to your Sunday visits with the Fletchers," she noted, a hint of amusement in her tone. "She's mentioned to at least 3 people that a woman of your position should be cautious about appearances." Margaret sighed. "I suspected as much from her pointed remarks after services, though what impropriety she imagines in the presence of a 9-year-old boy, I cannot fathom. It's not Daniel's presence that concerns her, but Ethan's availability." Sarah refilled their teacups. "You may not realize it, but you've achieved something remarkable in drawing Ethan Fletcher back into community life. Before your arrival, he spoke only when necessary at town meetings, attended church out of obligation, and avoided social gatherings entirely." "He's merely being polite to the new teacher," Margaret protested, though she'd noticed the gradual softening of Ethan's reserve during their interactions. Sarah's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. "Margaret, Ethan Fletcher has spent 6 years wrapped in grief and responsibility. Many tried to draw him out, including several unmarried women of appropriate age, with minimal success. Yet within weeks of your arrival, he's willingly participating in Sunday outings, attending school functions, and actually engaging in conversations beyond the strictly necessary." Margaret felt warmth rising in her cheeks. "We share certain experiences, loss, adjustment to unexpected circumstances. It's natural we would find common ground in conversation." "Precisely," Sarah agreed, "which is why Mrs. Whitman and her circle are watching with such interest. They've been trying to match Ethan with a suitable wife since the appropriate morning. Period ended without success. Now an unexpected candidate has appeared." "Candidate?" Margaret nearly choked on her tea. "Surely not. I'm a school teacher focused on establishing myself professionally. And Mr. Fletcher, Ethan, has given no indication of such interest." Sarah's eyebrows rose skeptically. "No? Perhaps you should observe more carefully during your next Sunday visit." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Sarah's comments lingered in Margaret's thoughts long after her friend departed. She had noticed Ethan's increasing comfort in her presence, his occasional unconscious gestures, a hand briefly touching her arm to emphasize a point, eyes seeking hers across the churchyard, small courtesies that went beyond mere politeness. Yet she had attributed these changes to growing friendship rather than deeper interest. At 42, Ethan Fletcher remained a handsome man, despite the lines that grief and responsibility had etched into his features. His intelligence, integrity, and quiet strength would make him an admirable partner for any woman of discernment. But Margaret had long since abandoned romantic aspirations, focusing instead on her teaching career and independence. Lewis Donovan's rejection had simply reinforced what she already knew. Her value lay in her mind and character, not in the increasingly limited prospects of her aging body. Yet as she prepared for bed that night, Margaret found herself considering possibilities she had thought closed to her. What if Sarah was right? What if Ethan's attention signified more than neighborly interest, and more unsettling? What if her own growing anticipation of their Sunday gatherings represented more than appreciation for stimulating conversation? Such thoughts were premature and potentially foolish, she chided herself. She had been in Cooperville less than a month. Her position required focus on her students, not personal entanglements that might complicate her professional standing. Besides, she had come west prepared to marry a stranger out of necessity, not romantic inclination. Any attachment formed now would require an entirely different foundation: mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. The school bell rang precisely at 8 the following morning, as it had each day since Margaret's arrival. But today, as students filed into the classroom and took their seats, she noticed Ethan Fletcher lingering at the edge of the schoolyard, watching the proceedings with an expression she couldn't quite interpret from a distance. When he caught her gaze, he nodded formally before turning toward town, his tall figure moving with the measured stride she had come to recognize. The encounter, brief as it was, left Margaret strangely unsettled throughout the morning lessons. Sarah's observations had planted seeds of awareness that now colored her perception of even this simple interaction. Had Ethan's presence been coincidental, or had he deliberately timed his route to coincide with the school's opening? Was his interest professional, the mayor observing the town's educational facility, or personal, a man seeking a glimpse of a woman who had begun to occupy his thoughts? Margaret pushed such speculations aside, focusing instead on the day's instruction. Today's natural science lesson involved identifying local plants and their uses, knowledge she had gleaned from Daniel's enthusiastic cataloging and Sarah's practical experience. The younger children approached the task with predictable excitement, while the older ones participated with varying degrees of engagement. William Griffith, to her surprise, contributed several observations about plants his Welsh grandfather had identified as similar to those in the old country. It was the first time he had voluntarily participated in class discussion, and Margaret noted the momentary animation in his normally guarded expression as he described his grandfather's remedies for common ailments. "Very insightful, William," she acknowledged. "Folk knowledge often precedes scientific understanding. Perhaps you might consider documenting your grandfather's remedies as your independent project this term. Such information could prove valuable to the community." The suggestion, part recognition, part challenge, seemed to intrigue the boy. He nodded thoughtfully before retreating back into his customary reticence, but Margaret had glimpsed the spark of intellectual curiosity she had hoped to nurture. Small victories, she reminded herself. Teaching was a profession of incremental progress, patience and faith in possibilities not yet realized. Much like life itself, spring yielded to summer in Cooperville, bringing longer days that Margaret filled with educational innovations. As the school term neared its conclusion, she organized an exhibition where students displayed projects demonstrating their progress. William Griffith's meticulously documented herbal remedies, Daniel Fletcher's illustrated bird journal, Elizabeth Patterson's historical account of the town's founding. Parents and townspeople wandered through the schoolroom, expressions of surprise and pride replacing the wariness that had greeted Margaret's arrival. "You've accomplished more than I dared hope," Ethan observed as they stood watching the community interact with the students. 3 months ago, these children were adrift. Now look at them." Pride warmed Margaret's chest as she surveyed the room. Even her most reluctant students had produced work that showcased their abilities. William Griffith stood beside his display, quietly explaining traditional remedies to Dr. Reed, who listened with genuine interest. The transformation in the boy was subtle but significant, his shoulders straighter, his eyes meeting others rather than avoiding contact. "They accomplished this themselves," Margaret replied. "I merely provided structure and encouragement." "You provided much more," Ethan countered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You showed them they still had futures worth preparing for." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Whitman, who approached with a visitor, a young woman of perhaps 25, fashionably dressed in a manner that seemed out of place in Cooperville. "Miss Wilson," Mrs. Whitman began with exaggerated formality. "May I present Miss Caroline Spencer? She's Reverend Whitman's niece from Springfield, visiting for the summer. She was a teacher at the Springfield Ladies' Seminary until recently." Margaret extended her hand warmly. "How wonderful to meet a fellow educator. I hope you'll share your experiences at the seminary. I'm always eager to learn new approaches." Miss Spencer's answering smile seemed forced. "How generous of you. Though I understand the demands of a rural school differ significantly from those of a proper seminary." The subtle condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Whitman continued with evident satisfaction. "Miss Spencer is considering a permanent position in Cooperville. The school board feels it would be advantageous to have a younger teacher who might remain with us for many years." The implication struck Margaret like a physical blow. 3 months of dedication, innovation, and progress were being casually dismissed in favor of youth, the same quality Lewis Donovan had prioritized in rejecting her as a bride. Ethan stepped forward, his expression unusually severe. "The school board has made no such determination, Mrs. Whitman. As chair of the town council, I would have been consulted regarding any change in Miss Wilson's status." Mrs. Whitman's thin smile didn't waver. "Naturally, proper procedures would be followed. We merely thought it prudent to explore options while Miss Spencer is visiting. Her youth and formal training at a prestigious institution represent significant advantages." Margaret maintained her composure with effort. "Every teacher brings different strengths to their role. I welcome Miss Spencer's observations of our school and would be happy to discuss pedagogical approaches with her." The diplomatic response seemed to disappoint Mrs. Whitman, who had clearly anticipated a more emotional reaction. After a few more stilted pleasantries, she guided Miss Spencer toward other attendees, leaving Margaret and Ethan in uncomfortable silence. "I apologize for that ambush," Ethan finally said. "Eleanor Whitman has no authority to suggest changes in your position, yet she clearly believes otherwise," Margaret noted, struggling to maintain her professional demeanor while processing this unexpected threat. "And her reasoning isn't entirely unsound. A younger teacher might indeed serve Coopersville longer." Ethan's gaze was direct and unwavering. "Age means nothing compared to ability and commitment. You've transformed this school in 3 months. The children are engaged, learning, and beginning to hope again." His voice lowered. "Besides, your future here involves more than just the schoolhouse." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Sarah Reed approached with Daniel, who was eager to show his father a particularly detailed sketch of a Western tanager. The moment for clarification passed, leaving Margaret to wonder at Ethan's cryptic statement as she continued greeting parents and showcasing student achievements. The exhibition concluded with unanimous praise from the community, even Mrs. Whitman's. Faction acknowledged the obvious progress the children had made under Margaret's guidance, though they attributed it to the students' natural abilities rather than her teaching methods. As twilight approached and the last visitors departed, Margaret began restoring order to the classroom. The physical labor of moving desks and organizing displays provided welcome distraction from her unsettled thoughts. Would the school board truly consider replacing her after all she had accomplished? Was her age once again to be the determining factor in her worthiness? "You shouldn't have to do this alone." Ethan's voice interrupted her ruminations. He stood in the doorway, jacket removed and sleeves rolled up. "Daniel's gone home with the Reeds for supper. I thought you might appreciate some assistance." Together they worked in companionable silence, returning the classroom to its original configuration. As they finished, Ethan paused, leaning against a desk with an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his posture. "Margaret, there's something I need to discuss with you. Would you walk with me? The evening's too fine to spend indoors." Curiosity overrode fatigue, and Margaret agreed. They followed the path leading behind the schoolhouse, past the garden now flourishing with summer vegetables, toward the small creek that marked the property's boundary. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, reminding Margaret of her first days in Cooperville, when everything had seemed strange and uncertain. "Mrs. Whitman's behavior today was unconscionable," Ethan began as they walked. "But it forces me to address something I've been contemplating for weeks." Margaret steeled herself for bad news. Perhaps the school board was indeed considering Miss Spencer, and Ethan, despite his personal support, was bound by community decisions. "Please speak plainly. I've faced disappointment before." Ethan stopped, walking, turning to face her directly. "This isn't about disappointment, Margaret. It's about possibility." He drew a deep breath. "Since Hannah died, I've focused solely on Daniel's welfare and my responsibilities to this town. I believed that chapter of my life, the personal happiness I once knew, was closed permanently." Margaret's heart quickened as she began to understand the direction of his words. "Your arrival changed that perspective," he continued. "You came to Coopersville having experienced your own losses, yet remained open to new beginnings. You saw value in damaged things. This town, these children, perhaps even in me." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "I find myself thinking of you constantly, your insight, your determination, your kindness. Daniel adores you, and I—" He faltered momentarily. "I've discovered feelings I thought long buried." Margaret stood perfectly still, scarcely breathing as Ethan continued. "I'm not offering a marriage of convenience or necessity, Margaret. I'm asking if you might consider building a life with me based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and what I believe could grow into deep affection." His eyes held hers steadily. "I realize this may seem sudden, but at our age, we've learned that opportunities for happiness shouldn't be squandered through excessive caution." The world seemed to pause around them as Margaret absorbed his words. 3 months ago, she had stood abandoned on a train platform, deemed too old for the future she had reluctantly chosen. Now this man, this thoughtful, honorable man, offered something far more precious than the arrangement she had made with Lewis Donovan. Ethan Fletcher wasn't seeking a broodmare or household manager. He wanted a partner, someone who complemented his strengths and shared his vision. "If you need time to consider," Ethan began when her silence extended. "No," Margaret interrupted softly. "I don't need more time." She squeezed his hand gently. "When Lewis Donovan rejected me for being too old, I believed he had confirmed what society had long implied, that a woman's value diminishes with her youth. I came to Coopersville expecting nothing more than employment and perhaps respect for my skills." She smiled, feeling a curious lightness spreading through her chest. "Instead, I found a community that needed exactly what I could offer. Children who responded to my experience rather than my appearance, and a man who sees me for who I truly am." "Is that yes?" Ethan asked, hope evident in his voice. "It is," Margaret confirmed, "though Mrs. Whitman will be scandalized by the impropriety of a schoolteacher becoming engaged before completing her first term." Ethan laughed, the sound reflecting a joy that transformed his solemn features. "Eleanor Whitman's displeasure is a small price to pay for happiness. Besides, her niece can now apply for the position you'll vacate when you become my wife, though I suspect the children will find her a poor replacement." "I needn't resign immediately," Margaret pointed out practically. "Many communities employ married teachers. We could propose such an arrangement until a suitable replacement is found. Always the teacher," Ethan murmured fondly, "finding the sensible solution." He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that belonged to a more gracious era. "This is why I love you, Margaret Wilson. Your mind is as beautiful as your heart." As twilight deepened around them, Margaret considered the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Rejection had led to opportunity, disappointment, to discovery. What Lewis Donovan had scorned as a liability, Ethan Fletcher treasured as an asset. Her supposed failings had become her greatest strengths in this place that needed precisely what she offered. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, as Ethan drew her gently into his embrace, being deemed too old was the greatest gift one could receive. For it directed you away from those who could never appreciate your true worth, and toward those who recognized that some treasures become more valuable with time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.